A gut Elefeich, ich heiße Shane Baker. I'm Shane Baker of the Congress for Jewish Culture. And thank you for tuning in this afternoon to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the world premiere of the Dybbuk. What I believe Debra Caplan here says is arguably, I leave out the arguably, the most iconic play in the Jewish canon. And if you didn't say that, you did now. In any event, this is part of a few events that we're putting together, including a YouTube premiere of a production, a Zoom production of the Dybbuk in Yiddish. Michal Weichert said in a review of the Dybbuk by Habima that Ha Dybbuk is nicht der Dybbuk, that language is not merely external on the stage, it is the heart and the soul of the performance. So we felt it was important to have a new Yiddish Dybbuk to commemorate that. But there's a lot to say about this play, about Shin Ansky, who wrote it, about the Vilna Troupe, who first produced it, and we've gathered some experts in each of these fields to talk about it. And moderating the panel will be my friend Caraid O'Brien, who was tutored by the last remaining member of the Vilna Troupe, Debra Caplan, a friend also of mine, and she'll be running the discussion. Caraid is a playwright, a fantastic writer, even in prose, and a wonderful actress as well. If you'd like to hear some of her recent work, she's been reading memoirs on The Maximalist, a podcast of the National Yiddish Book Center. She recently read from Clara Klebanova's memoir about the Russian Revolution. Just go to yiddishbookcenter.org/maximalist, and you can hear that. I'm going to turn things over to Caraid now. Caraid?
Oh, thanks so much, Shane, and thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this with these incredible Yiddish scholars and with yourself. This play is so important to me, and this anniversary is so important to me because it is tied up with my decade-long friendship with Luba Caddison Buloff, who was, as she was to you, Shane, and it's lovely that you invited me to speak about her because you knew her just as well. And I should say about Shane that Luba loved him tremendously, and I'm sure you're not surprised to hear that. And we would meet every Sunday at her apartment on the Upper West Side, Luba and myself. And it was like going into a salon. You know, there were many cats and Arbit Blattis and all of these Rubens on the wall. And then there was the actual original set designs of the Dybbuk, which her father, Leib Caddison, had designed. And we studied Yiddish literature together, and we spent a long time working on the role of Leah from the Dybbuk, which she originally played Leah's friend, and she went on then later in the 30s and 40s to play Leah. And you know, what impressed me so much about her and about the play was how the Vilna Troupe had come together under extraordinary circumstances to create art. It was the Vilna Troupe started in World War I rather, and their first subsidy was several bags of potatoes, which Luba's mother cooked for the actors so they wouldn't faint from hunger in the rehearsals. So just like yourself, Shane, as I was creating an artistic identity for myself in the tiny theaters of Ludlow Street and not having any money or not feeling like I didn't have any opportunity or nobody was seeing what I was doing, you know, she would counter with these stories. And the message that she gave and that the Vilna Troupe provided to me and to all the artists who would visit her was that under all circumstances, you've got to create your art because that is what will save you. And there's never an excuse. It's never money. It's never time. There's never an excuse for not creating the work that is inside of you and that you feel that you have to get out. And, you know, the Dybbuk, the play between two worlds, her apartment was filled with ghosts. We would talk about Mazo. We would talk about Bulow, who passed away before I could meet him. We would talk about Paula Walters and Leah Noemi and Avram Borevsky and Noah Nachbush. And she would conjure up these ghosts, and they would leave her imagination and come into the room, and she would teach me about how they would perform, or you know, the stories that happened to them. And it's an incredible moment that this is the 100th anniversary today, 100 years ago today. This play premiered 30 days rather after Ansky's death. And just think of Lithuania at that time and Eastern Europe at that time, coming out of World War I, coming out of a 2-year pandemic, just as we are now, you know, in the midst of this horrible crisis that affects everyone. And looking to that play for inspiration when we have, you know, 250,000 Americans dead. And so we're, you know, the great line from the play, Bubenu, was wird der Mensch, was starb vor der Zeit? Wie kommt hin sein nicht der Leben, seine Freude und seine Leid, seine Tefilles, was seinen übergerissen geworden? And right now, we have so many people, what happened to their lives that were cut short by the situation affecting everyone in the world. And so I'd like to just ask everyone to talk a little bit about their expertise with regards to this play. And Itzik, I'd love to start with you. Itzik, of course, is an incredible scholar of Yiddish culture and folklore, and his book, Defining Yiddish Nation, is a wonderful read. And I know you're working on some new folkloric material. And I'd love you to speak a little bit, introduce us all to Ansky and his background as a folklore collector and what led him to write this play. Oh, Itzik, I think you're muted. So just click on your microphone.
Yes, I got it. Well, starting in about 1907, 1908, he was going from his leftist political work and moving more toward folklore. And really, he used folklore to inspire art. And he wanted to collect to sort of form a basis for a modern Jewish culture. And it, you know, it was a two or 3 years it took him to raise enough money to go on this famous expedition, which lasted from 1912 to 1914. He visited 60 towns in 3 provinces, Volyn, Podolia, and the Kiev region. And so all the folklore, so the Dybbuk allowed him to put all of his folkloric knowledge into this play. And I think you could sort of tell that he expected the audience not to be familiar with these. It was already, I mean, a bunch of articles have been written about Russian, and it was really designed for a upper middle class Russian audience in a way, because he's sort of using what he found stories about. Well, you know, if we want to get into the gravestone in the middle of the market of the groom and the bride who were killed, he actually recorded that on his expedition. Tales of the Dybbuk were part of his recordings. But of course, he gives it a little romantic twist at the end. But the trial between the living and the dead, visit to the graveyard to visit the parents before the wedding, or the mother in this case to the wedding. This is all things that he found out on his expeditions, and including the music as well, allowed him to put it into one play, the Dybbuk, which he was so proud of. He thought it really was his life's work. I have another connection to the Dybbuk in that I performed in it in Yiddish, which I think is one of the reasons Shane asked me onto the panel.
Yes, I'm looking forward to hearing about that production. as well. I remember reading about it because Miriam Crescent was in it. She played the beggar woman, right? Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a terrible actor. I just did it because I knew the Yiddish acting world is its own little, microcosm, its own little world with its traditions. And this was 1981. Yablokov signed the checks. I mean, so you still had the old guard was around. And yeah, I wanted to point out 3 memories from that production.
Please go ahead.
Well, the director was Shimon Finkel, born in Poland, but he was in the original, the Israeli Habima production. He was an amazing actor, terrible director, but a fantastic, terrible, but in a good sense for a folklorist, because you felt that he was directing it exactly as he had been directed in the 1920s. He didn't have any flexibility at all. It was like he had this vision, and everyone had the feeling this is the way he did it, 70 years earlier. So as a folklorist, that was quite good. But in general, I was impressed by everyone's acting in that play. The woman who played Leah was Joanna Pellet, who was like an East Village, avant-garde actress. She was tall. For Leah, of course, she had the long braids, but she must have been 6 feet tall. So when the Dybbuk entered her, and her voice dropped, to reflect the male on the stage. She, because the braids form this 4-foot radius around her, and it's like everyone's going, ah! She was really good. The other thing was what I wanted to mention, because I don't know if we'll get around to the film, but the play was much better than the film, in my opinion. Much tighter. I mean, the first half hour of the film is done in 3 minutes in the play. It's the opening, exposition of a play. I also was, as I said, it's quite possible that he wrote it originally in Russian, but the Yiddish is very good. I mean, very folky. Even if if Ansky translated from the Russian to the Yiddish, I was very impressed by the Yiddish. And also there's a lot of comedy in the play too. I don't know a lot of comedy, but there's some comedy in the play. And I think it's a wonderful play for that reason. It's like there's seriousness, but then there's comic scenes as well. And I think it's a really, that's why it's such a classic play. Wow. It's not just one downer all the way. Yeah.
Yes, there's so much contained within it. And Debra, I just want to ask you, as an expert on the Vilna Troupe and your wonderful book, The Yiddish Empire, about how vast the company was. I'm so sorry that Luba didn't get to read that and to meet you. She would have enjoyed that conversation very much. But I was wondering if you could tell a little bit about the inaugural production in 1920.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, it's exciting to talk about this today, 100 years ago, right? When this happened, 100 years ago today, that this production premiered, this iconic 20th century landmark theater production. So the Vilna Troupe, their production of the Dybbuk, it sort of, it happened on purpose, and it also sort of happened by accident. They were looking for new material that met their sort of high art standards. They wanted to be an art theater. They wanted to produce only the most literary work. They heard about the Dybbuk. They met with Ansky. They said they were interested in producing it, and Ansky was absolutely delighted because he had so many times where he had tried to get this play produced, and in Russian, in Hebrew, in Yiddish, and people kept turning him down over and over again. Some because they thought the play was not that great of a play, which is sort of hilarious now, and some because of other things, like they were going to produce it at the Moscow Art Theater, but then the Russian Revolution happened, and they thought maybe we should do a different kind of season this year, given everything going on in the world, and they scrapped the Dybbuk. So the Vilna Troupe met with Ansky. They were going to sort of put this into their plans to produce later, and then 3 weeks after they met him, he suddenly died. And the Vilna Troupe's business manager and sort of marketing genius, who Caraid, you mentioned earlier, Mordechai Mazo, he thought, what an opportunity. And so at Ansky's funeral, in front of tens of thousands of mourners, he, very dramatically got up in front of the grave and he said, I solemnly swear that we, the Vilna Troupe, will produce Ansky's greatest play. And not only will we produce it for the first time ever, but we will produce it in exactly 30 days' time at the close of the traditional 30-day period of mourning. So all the Vilna Troupe members gathered at that funeral were pretty surprised to hear it. And Mazo, it was very dramatic. He went a step further and he said, and if we don't produce it, if we don't make it happen in 30 days, may I die right on this spot, right in front of Ansky's grave. May God strike me dead, right? So he really made a dramatic pitch. Tens of thousands of people said, oh, that sounds like an interesting production, the one that he, swears upon his life that he will produce in front of Ansky's grave. And that started to generate some buzz for the sort of the absolute buzziest hit of the season, not just when the Vilna Troupe produced it in Warsaw, but also as different Vilna Troupe companies took it around the world, first to Berlin and then sort of across Eastern and Western Europe. And then production started popping up, not just in Yiddish, but in other languages, in English, in Hebrew, in Polish, in Russian, in Norwegian. And it became sort of a very, globally known play. So, that's something that I think is just really fascinating to think about, that they sort of stumbled into this. This wasn't exactly the type of play they typically did. They met with Ansky, they sort of followed a lead, they met with Ansky, they thought, oh, this sounds interesting. And then sort of for marketing purposes, right, they sort of got sucked into this whole, we're going to produce this massive, massive play in 30 days. And it became an absolute hit. So partially, I think, because the play is so powerful and so good and so interesting, partially, I think, because of the way the Vilna Troupe sort of framed it, and partially the way that they took it and produced it, and partially the way they sort of took it on the road and brought it to lots and lots of people and got a lot of attention for it.
Wow.
So
and David Herman was the first director of it. He grew up in a Hasidic family. Is that right? Or
that's right. David Herman was the first and the second director of the Dybbuk. So he directed the Vilna Troupe's production in Warsaw, which became a just complete and utter hit. The press was talking about Dybbuk mania. People were roaming through the streets singing the Song of Songs melody from their production of the Dybbuk. People were just running to this production in droves. They couldn't, print the tickets fast enough. But then there was a second Vilna Troupe company that at this point was in Berlin, and they heard about how great the first Vilna Troupe was doing, and they brought the same director, David Herman, over to direct a carbon copy of the same production in Berlin that they then took on the road. So you had this same production basically with different actors circulating in Eastern and Western Europe at the same time. And audiences just sort of hearing about how it was everywhere, and it was like the hit of Odessa, the hit of Paris, the hit of Bucharest, the hit of Berlin. So that sort of furthered his reputation. But yeah, they hired Herman because he grew up in a Hasidic family. He had that depth of experience. He could speak to the sort of religious context of the play, and of course Herman at that point had sort of moved away from all of that, and he was more interested in exploring avant-garde theatrical ideas and modalities. So the Vilna Troupe produced this really fascinating production that's super religiously steeped and very, deep into the sort of mystical modality of this play and Hasidism, but also does all these things that were really sort of trendy new or in Austria in that period.
Thank you. Well, and now I want to introduce Nahma Sandrow, whose book Vagabond Stars is so many people's, certainly mine, tens of thousands of people's first introduction to Yiddish theater and to beginning to understand its history. And Nahma, I'd love you to speak a little bit about the next 100 years for the Dybbuk, or how it went from being this Vilna Troupe production to such an important, iconic work.
Yeah, I'll begin. We've had a request already for just to tell the basic plot of the play. There is a couple who are in love, Leah and Chonan. She's a rich girl and he's a poor student. And her off to somebody else. And in order to join her, because he loves her, in order to get her to be married to her, he becomes a Dybbuk in effect, which means he enters her body, he possesses her. She is possessed by his soul. Eventually, he's exorcised by a wonder working rabbi, but he goes, oh, I can't even explain to you where he goes because I don't understand it himself, but he goes somehow into the mystic realms and she dies so as to follow him. That's the story. That's the plot.
Thank you.
And it was done for 100 years, starting 100 years ago. It was done over and over and over on the stage. I've seen a lot of productions of it, including films of the Dybbuk. There are several operas of the Dybbuk. There's at least one ballet of the Dybbuk, and in a lot of languages, including, as I just learned from Debra, in Norwegian. And people say about it that it is emblematic of Yiddish theater because it is so popular. So the question is why? And there are few answers, I think. One is, of course, it's very theatrical, it's very powerful theatrically, and it was, after all, originally shaped not just by Ansky, but by directors, by several directors. Elements of it actually came in production, in rehearsal rather, they came from directors, elements which then become incorporated and are considered the part of the play itself, the essence of the play. And it is malleable, evident, to many different productions and many different approaches. For Jews or non-Jews who don't or can't believe in Dybbuks, in Torah, in prayer, in the soul, in God, one of the reasons why it's been so powerful, I think, is that it's a way in, and it gives an illusion, a theatrical illusion of an authentic experience. So that somehow it seems to be touching the roots, an old-time Eastern European religion, a kind of way of touching spirituality and the divine, doing it through folklore and through history. After all, the grave, there's center of the stage, there is a grave of lovers who are supposed to have been murdered in pogroms a long time before. And so the grave is there, the history is there, and the sounds and the images are all thrilling. But it's also true that the play is seen, the experience is, it's from the outside. It's not religious exactly. It's not, the perspective is a perspective, I think, of alienation from religion. It's 100 years in which audiences, in any case, audiences for theater, are audiences who are not necessarily religious. They are the rabbi who tries to exorcise the Dybbuk is helpless, and prayers are useless. And what the real power in this play is nothing religious at all. It's the individual will of the lover who has been thwarted. And that, I think, is Ansky, who was a revolutionary, late in his life, he came back, and he was experiencing the poetry of religion, the poetry of Yiddishkeit, from the outside, what had become from the outside. So Ansky and his audiences, they were, and they still are, and what the play reflects, I think, when it was finally produced 50 years ago, was not 50 years ago, 100 years ago, was the same world that Einstein came out of, and Freud and Marx. It's a time of doubt. It's a time of Dada. Dada was new and thrilling at that time. World War I, and World War I, especially in Eastern Europe, where there was destruction of the Jewish community and massacres of the Jews. What was in the air when he wrote this was nihilism. And I think, guys, it's a play about death. The victory in this play, the lovers are dead, and their future is dead. There are no children. There's several times in the script they mention there will be no children from this love match of the two of them joined in limbo, wherever they're joined. The central image is the grave of the lovers who were killed at their wedding. The ethnography he was doing, he got his information from his ethnographic expedition, which he took because the old ways were dying. It was a way of salvaging. And death is, in this play, the match is, the eroticism is death. Death is erotic. Guys, death enters her body. The Dybbuk enters her body. It's a very sexy play, and it's a very spooky play. It works for Hollywood.
It is. And the way that they're trying to find meaning, she's trying to find meaning in all this death, in her dead mother, in the mass death, in the death of her first betrothed. What happens? It can't go, just like you can light a candle again. Certainly you can light a life again. Itzik, I wanted you to talk about what Nahma was bringing up about this tension between the rabbinic Judaism and the folklore rituals that are so beautiful on stage. But what was that like in real life? What was the tension there between, what did the rabbis think of these folk rituals?
Well, this was certainly the period in which it was pulling apart. It's a play. It's not a play about young love. It's not a play about love that's stronger than death. Death is stronger, and it belongs in the canon of modern European literature in that way. It's about the crumbling of everything. It's not romantic, except in a very different sense.
I would add that I wanted to point out that, first of all, Ansky was drawn to Hasidism for its mystical quality, for its spirituality. And I also wanted to mention that, the Dybbuk, the exorcisms of Dybbuk, but there actually are recorded, I think, 200 episodes of rabbis driving out Dybbukim. And eventually it started with Ashkenaz, but eventually went to the Sephardic world as well. And the telling of the Dybbuk legend was a chance to say how great your rabbi was, how great your Rebbe. My Rebbe is so great that, he drove out the Dybbuk, in one day or whatever I'm saying. But, it used to be competitive. Whose Rebbe, whose Hasidic rabbi is greater? And telling Dybbuk's legends was one aspect of that. And that's why it continued for so long and spread as the Hasidic movement spread. Usually it was a man entering a woman, but not always. There are a few cases of a woman entering a woman entering a man, a few. And in a lot of the world is a positive thing. Like the person who gets by, let's say in Africa, the person who gets possessed by a spirit is considered on a higher level. But in Jewish tradition and Catholic tradition as well, as you can see from the film, The Exorcist, it's a bad, it is not natural. It is a bad thing. The person who gets possessed was possessed for a reason, some sin they had, right? In Bashevis Singer's Satan and Garay, she gets possessed because I think she stubs her finger and says, the devil take it, or something like that. Just she says something, and that allows her to open up to be possessed by a Dybbuk, which is what happens in that story as well. So to be possessed, you had to have sinned also in a way. So the story veers a little off that, because Leah, I don't know what sin she has done, other than
Definitely.
Maybe going to the graveyard alone.
Her father broke his vow.
Right, which is considered he's up in heaven. They're like noticing that you made a vow that wasn't kept. Right, there were about 3 or 4 Yiddish films just on that legend about the importance of making a vow.
When you talk about the Dybbuk story, where is it recorded? Is it recorded in rabbinic literature or in other places, or the Dybbuks that you were mentioning?
In collections of rabbinic legends, like the Vizhnitzer Rebbe will have a book about legends about him. The Chortkever Rebbe will have legends about him, and that will include Dybbuk tales, but including the 20th century. I mean, because actually Hasidism, still exists today, but it was widespread before the war. In fact, the most widespread Orthodox religion for Jews was Hasidism before the Second World War. When I teach, there is a collection called Hasidic Legends in the New World, collected in Brooklyn. And one of the legends there says, about the Satmar Rebbe, I think, that the mother brought the daughter to the Rebbe to drive out the Dybbuk, and the rabbi said, you should see a psychiatrist. So I call that the last, when the Rebbe himself tells you to see a psychiatrist, I think that's the last Dybbuk legend we're going to hear for a while. Wow. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say that one thing I used to spend a lot of time talking to Luba about was the different acting styles between her and her husband, Joseph Buloff. He was a perfectionist. He spent hours in makeup. He would 3 hours before he would perform, he would get ready and transform himself. And she liked to just go on. And the most memorable performance of the Dybbuk to her, and she played it all over the world, was it was a benefit performance for Lazar Fried, the actor, who was ill at the time, was in the 40s at Maury Schwartz's theater, and she played the female lead. And she taught, Molly Picon played the beggar woman, and she taught her to do it in the style of Paula Walter, which was to frighten. I mean, it's a beggar woman in a graveyard, saying, come dance with me, come dance with me. And for her, she said she almost doesn't remember the performance. She felt like she was channeling it. And it's this idea of these primitive rituals, or primal rituals of exorcism, of dealing with spirits, which is in a play, right? Which is in the ritual of theater. And it's ritual laid upon ritual, and it creates this sort of energetic magic, whether you believe in Dybbuks or not. I think it's a real spell casting involved that's, you know, endemic to the script itself. And I wondered if any of you wanted to talk about either a favorite scene in the Dybbuk that you saw, or about the rituals on stage and how that kind of intensifies their dramatic effect.
I would just add one. My mother saw the play in Chernovitz, and what she remembered was the line, "In the Kale Zarayna Dybbuk," you know, which in the film they really, but for her it was a ghost story, you know, for her it was, as a 12, 13-year-old or whatever, younger, it was basically a horror movie, you know. That's the way she remembered it.
Well, I can, just to talk about the rituals, I think that one of the things that the Vilna Troupe and other future productions did very successfully was really to, you know, to lean really heavily and really play up the ritualistic atmosphere of the play and create a production that feels like you are sort of part of like a ritualized experience, right? There's, you know, there's a lot of musical sort of music that evokes various types of sort of Jewish ritual. In the Vilna Troupe's original production, the entire curtain was framed by a gigantic oversized tallis, a gigantic prayer shawl that opened and closed as the acts started and ended, right? Which evokes, again, specific ritual acts. It puts the audience into a certain position of being sort of privy in part to a ritual experience. So I think that the idea of ritual is like at the center of this play and how it's been produced. And I think that that was something that kind of helped to cast a spell for audiences, that you're like entering a ritual space, something special and sacred and holy, but not, you know, also not unsecular either, right? Because most of these theater companies saw themselves as,
and the audiences did as well. I mean, that's the sneaky genius of it, that it's all modern. It's all modern. It's all from the outside. It's not from the inside. It's all from the outside, and yet it gives the illusion, the exciting, the titillating sensation that you're inside. It's like a spooky movie, only it's got more layers, you know. It's it's a kind of genius combination, but from the outside. Yeah.
And does anyone have anything to say about the adaptations of the Dybbuk, like The 10th Man, or I know Lubo talked about a version she saw that was set in Greenwich Village, and she didn't like that. But what do you think about either interpretations or rewritten versions of the Dybbuk that you have seen or read about, or what do you think is the future for that kind of interpretation of the Dybbuk?
It sounds like Nahma has seen a lot more performances than we have. I saw one in Hebrew in Jerusalem where the rabbi's table with his Hasidim around him was in a ruin, like a bombed out ruin. Which gave it a nice atmospheric. But you know, there were good things and bad things about it. But I thought the set was great.
Well, I would just say that this is what makes theater lasting, right? Is like you know, what is the definition of a play that lasts beyond its time? It's a play that's continuously reinvented for another time, for a new audience in a different way. The Dybbuk certainly passes that test with flying colors, and you know, and it will continue to. It is a remarkably, as specific as it is and as grounded in a specific world as it is also remarkably adaptable and has that sort of flexibility to it, right? So that's, you know, that to me is like, that's how you know a play is going to last. I have no doubt that people will still be talking about the Dybbuk 100 years from now. And I think that's because it has that quality, has that like elasticity that allows artists to play. Space to play.
Yeah, I agree. But I would like to add that it also, one reason why it draws so much is that a century, starting the 2nd century. For modern people, it gives the, it's not just art, it allows you to feel as if you are participating in something ancient and that you are part of the mysteries in the religious sense. In fact, for that, it is synthetic. It's not, that's not genuine. It's art. But people that are, those of us for whom the religion and religiousness are not quite accessible, it lets you shiver a little bit.
It's amazing how, as theater people who are passionate about theater, or actors or directors, there are certain texts that follow you around in your life. You know, for me, that's God of Vengeance. For Luba, it was definitely the Dybbuk. And, you know, Miriam Orleska, the first actress to play the role, she was forever identified with it. Debra, do you want to talk a little bit about what happened to her, or how she became almost trapped by that part?
Sure. I mean, she's not the first actor or actress to have that experience, right? The Dybbuk became such an iconic production and so iconically associated with the Vilna Troupe and Miriam Orleska in that role of Leia that it was hard for her to sort of find another voice as an actor. And she was, the rest of her life, she was sort of criticized she played, and it's hard to tell, right, from somebody, you know, from the outside, from years later, you know, what exactly that is. You know, it could be the audience could not stop seeing her as Leia, the reviewers could not stop seeing her as Leia, and it could be that she herself, you know, that was such a star role for her that she sort of got a little bit trapped by it.
You know, I just see in the comments that the writer and archivist Faith Jones has said that her great aunt was exercised in Brooklyn in the 1910s, so 1910 around. That's pretty. It's a pretty incredible detail. Shane, I know that you are not an official member of the discussion, but I'd love to. I know you've worked on the text, and you have this. The Congress has this beautiful premiere coming up on December 14th at 7 p.m. Would you like to tell us a little bit about it and your thoughts on the Dybbuk?
Well, I probably have more questions at this point. Thank you all for joining us in this panel. You've all had really great and interesting things to say, but I'm curious to a degree, you know, has Yiddish theater been trapped by the Dybbuk in the way that Orleska was? I wonder if Nahma would feel that way based on some of what she's saying. I'm also interested in the point about the movie as opposed to the play itself. I think the movie is actually what people think of when they think of the Dybbuk. Most people, I would say. Someone who has not been involved with a production or seen a production would probably think of the movie. And is that a good thing? Because, you know, there's substantial dramaturgical differences. And Ansky's play, there's a little bit of fat in it, but I would say for all of the weaving together of folk legends, as Itzik has pointed out, and it is just one folk legend after another, it really is, it holds together as a dramatic text remarkably well. It's an awfully gripping story for someone who didn't, you know, write plays without end and who had 100 other careers. Ansky really knocked it out of the park, so to speak, with the Dybbuk in a dramaturgical sense, I think. When we were looking at putting this production together, I said, let's read the whole thing. There was an attempt to get the original Vilna script. but that proved to be very difficult. It came like months too late. I should have turned to Dobelea. She probably has one lying about somewhere. She can get anything. She got hold of my master's thesis, which I had requested be locked and not shared with anyone. And somehow she was able to cite that. It was a question of the text. And I dealt a little with Leah Koenig, and she suggested an adaptation that Dina Halperin had put together, and it's substantially shortened and relies a bit on the narrator, a narrator, aside from the Mishulach, a narrator figure. And we were going to do that as kind of the John Robinson version, but I turned to Alan Lewis Rickman to direct it, and Alan is a playwright, and he likes to adapt things and redo them in a certain way. And so he added in quite a bit from the original play, including the town Rov as opposed to the miracle worker. And I actually wound up with this role of the town Rov, who tells the story, who relates the sin of the father. As the Meshulach says early on, sometimes a child is punished for the sins of the parent. And then in the trial scene with Sender and his yeshiva friend, Nissen ben Rivke, then we learn what that sin is. And dramatically, that's so much more interesting than the movie, which winds up being a flat narrative of this happens, this, and it goes straight through. But there's a little bit of a mystery in the play. I mean, not for any one of you, but it's constructed with a little bit of something to find out at the end, in addition to that change. Anyway, that's kind of what I've got to say. I think I asked a couple questions you could talk about, and I'm going to start putting some questions from Facebook into the chat, which you can go to or disregard as you like. But Caraid, thank you for letting me speak a bit. I'll turn back to you as I fulfill that mission.
Well, does anyone have, yes, go on.
Monday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the YouTube channel of the Congress for Jewish Culture. I'll put it into chat, and you can sign up there for an alert, or go to our webpage, congressforjewishculture.org, sign up to get an alert when it goes live on Monday. It'll stay up if you're in another time zone. Okay.
And that's actually Luba's, would be her 114th birthday on December 14th. And, she was acting in the play, but to learn more about the craft of acting. So she was acting in Yiddish at night, studying in Polish, and she brought it was a very respected dramatic school, and she brought her teachers to see their production in Warsaw, and simultaneously translated for them the first act, and then for the second act she ran backstage and did her role. So it's amazing to think that she was 14 at this time, and what I have a son who's 14, and what a formative experience. And then, but she was somebody who was not trapped by the role, because she lived a full life. She lived to be 100 at least, or around. Her birth date is in some question, around 1906. So is there anything that people would like to respond to what Shane brought up?
Well, in a sense, Jewish folklore has been trapped because, those are the two, eternal, that people know about, what they know about Jewish folklore. And they're very different. I mean, the golem is sort of a group fantasy. There never was really a golem, but then, as I pointed out, there were exorcisms of Dybbuks. So they're very different. But those after teaching many years of Jewish folklore, that's what they come into class knowing about Jewish folklore.
Wow. I'm translating some Sholem Ash now, and he has rituals within his play, like including one in this play that was written in 1914, our faith, and if they bring a brick to a rabbi to put a spell on, then the mother has to light a candle and put it on top it so that her daughter, who has converted to Christianity and is in the middle of childbirth, so that the child will die and the daughter will come back. And there was a rabbi involved in that story of the folk ritual. So it's and it's very powerful. I just think it's just layering. It's ritual on top of ritual, and it makes you shiver because you can tell that the other world is being called in. We've got some good quotes here too. Somebody was saying that it's more like Tristan and Isolde, the play, and David Braun says, Nahma, one may be seeing the play from the outside, but as an insider. Couldn't we say that about most modern Yiddish art and belonging?
That's very smart. But then you could say that about a lot of Yiddish culture altogether. And in fact, you can say that about living a Yiddish-speaking life in the modern era, whenever you want to say the modern era began. Yeah, I have to think about that. I think that's smart, David.
What's amazing to me about Ansky's role as a folklorist and then kind of creating an identity for the Yiddish theater, being that the Dybbuk is his most famous play, is that at the same time, Lady Gregory and Yeats in Ireland were collecting these Irish folk tales and translating them. Yeah. And they were, making Sean O'Casey, the great playwright that he is, and creating plays like Kathleen the Houlihan that were a mixture of folk tales and stories. And so it was happening in two different cultures at the same time, except for the Irish were doing it in translation already, right? They weren't even attempting to create the theater in Irish, but the Yiddish theater was able to do that, to keep their language.
Not just Ireland and Yiddish. I mean, in the 19th century to sort of, which very much have the same aims, like Yeats would use the folk materials for higher art, right? To inspire, Irish, modern Irish culture.
Yeah, so not for the folk, for the people who could look at the folk from the outside. One of the differences between, we have to remember that the people that saw the Dybbuk then actually came from towns where many of these, where the folklore was still alive. And that was true for a few generations afterwards. So we're seeing it from a much further remove. There's less dawn than they probably did.
Wow. We have another interesting comment, from Claire Green. An unsuccessful exorcism was performed on our street in suburban DC by Rabbi Novoseller in 1988, who was paid to exorcise a house with a Jewish family originally from the USSR. They wanted to avoid the tragedy that had befallen the prior residents, whose only child, a teenage boy, was killed in a car wreck. Well, the exorcism was a failure, and the father from Moscow died unexpectedly. So that's 1988 in DC. And here's a question from Eve Sicular, which I don't have an answer to, maybe you guys do. Does the film versus the theater script add anything in dramatizing the story of Nissen and Sender in the Rebbe's court?
A short, quick 5 minutes. It adds a lot. It adds a lot of backstory and leans heavily on that backstory. And depending on your thoughts on the film, that's either really successful or, or less dramaturgically successful. I don't know if others want to weigh in on that.
I agree.
Yeah.
mean, the film wasn't the first to add backstory. So the Vilna Troupe's production added a prologue where the souls of Leah and Chonin are subconsciously drawn to one another before birth. You know, imagine what that might have looked like. It's a little hard to imagine, but they felt like the play needed more of a starting point, a little more backstory before it started up.
So what do you mean they were in togas or something? They were in.
You know, it's really unclear because this is described in so many reviews, but not in enough detail to really understand. But what's described, all I know is that there was music and their souls were subconsciously drawn to one another before the curtain opened and before the action of the play started. And it was just to symbolize their souls being united before they were separated. So yeah, a little hard to know exactly, but in my imagination, it's something sort of, you know, avant-garde movement based.
Wow. And of course, there was Pearl Lang did a famous dance version. Luba spoke so warmly about that production.
You know, the Dybbuk production that I was in, Pearl Lang was the choreographer.
Oh, wow.
And if I can relate one episode.
Please.
So she came the first day of rehearsal, she came in and I'm there with 4 Yiddish actors, all of them quite old. And she just says, show me what you can do. So there's no music playing and these 4 old Jews are basically prancing around, dancing with no music. I started hysterically laughing and I fell to the floor. But she did the choreography, which I think of the film, you know, was such a center point. What people remember is the dance of death and Judith Burke did the choreography. Mm-hmm. Judith. So dance is important in the play. Yes.
I'll just add that at Itzik's initiative, the Congress honored giants of Jewish dance about 15 years ago, Pearl Lang and Felix Fiebig. And when we were talking with Pearl, we asked about video of dance that we could show and asked about that version of the Dybbuk. And she said, oh, no, we can't do that. But Chana Polak of the Yiddish Forward found the footage of the dance and she of the dance version, she watched it, and the dance that she performed at the grave was just so incredible. She said, oh, it wouldn't mean anything without the context, but we played it and you could have heard a pin drop in the theater. So that whole film of the dance version of the Dybbuk she made is available at Lincoln Center. And when things are normal again, it's probably well worth checking out. Her dance at the mother's grave is just breathtaking. Yeah.
Wow. And Sonia Gollins has a great new book about Jewish dance out, and she's doing a lot of research, I know, on the choreographer Judith Berg, is it, or
Berg,
that we just
Judith
yeah.
Berg.
Yeah,
yes.
Berg. Yeah.
Well, does anyone have anything else that they'd like to say as we wrap?
Is 120, I don't know.
Yeah.
I see it continuing for many more years, being produced.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to tuning in on Monday night, Shane, and seeing that.
Do you have to register for that, Shane? You have
to... No, I've put the YouTube channel in the comments on Facebook, but you can just go to the YouTube channel of the Congress for Jewish Culture on Monday evening, and you'll see it's coming up. Or you can write me at KONGRES, Congress in Yiddish, KONGRES at earthlink.net, and I'll send you an alert via email.
We have one more shout out here. Did anyone ever see or know anything about Jerome Robbins' ballet of the Dybbuk with Bernstein's music? No, I haven't seen that either. But as always, the audience for Yiddish events is incredibly well seen and read.
Thank you.
Well, so thanks so much. Shane, shall we wrap it up? Great. Well, maybe we'll meet in person someday soon.
Hope so.
That would be nice.
All right. Thank you all for participating in the panel. Caraid, thank you so much for running it. And yeah, I think this is a good lasting document. Again, for what it's worth, Nahma Sandrow wrote Vagabond Stars, which remains to this day the definitive English language history of world Yiddish theater. And Debra Caplan wrote, I'm forgetting it.
The Yiddish Empire.
Yiddish Empire.
Which is, it's just an expansive and wonderfully interesting history of the Vilna Troupe. Itzik Gottesman wrote Defining the Yiddish Nation, which is a great examination of various Yiddish folklorists and goes well beyond the Dybbuk into many more fascinating aspects of Yiddish folklore. All these books are in English, so most of you who are watching can read them. And Caraid, you have your translation of God of Vengeance is published, other publications that you have up or out?
Yeah, there's some on Amazon. Some of my plays are on Amazon, and yeah. And The Last Maximalist, check it out and let me know what you think. I'd love for you to listen to it. yiddishbookcenter.org/maximalist.
Okay, right.
Thank you.
Shkoyach Ale.
Okay.
Thank you everyone in Facebook land for tuning in. Seid gesund. That's the main thing.
Yes. Amen.
So I'm going to end the live broadcast. There we go. That's the, that Caraid took off already. That's the end of the live broadcast. But Adank Ale, thank you. And
thank you for organizing. This was great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good to hear your voices, and
Likewise.
let's all stay well, I guess.
Thanks, Shane.
Yeah.
See you
All right, bye,
Monday.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.